The room was washed in a pale, late-afternoon light, the kind that lingers for a moment before fading, as if reluctant to let go. Matthew Perry sat quietly on the edge of his bed, the weight of years etched softly across his face. To the world he was Chandler Bing, the man who made millions laugh without effort. But in those final weeks, his eyes carried a depth that no punchline could mask. His breathing was slow, steady, almost meditative, as though he were trying to make sense of something only he could feel. Friends said he had grown quieter, more reflective. There was an unusual calmness in him, like a man standing at the edge of a vast, silent ocean. And then, just weeks before his death, Matthew wrote something, a message so raw, so unexpectedly vulnerable, that those who later read it felt their hearts fracture. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a witty line or a cryptic metaphor. It was something he had never allowed himself to say aloud. Before we retrace the final chapters of his life, the battles, the triumphs, the haunting loneliness he tried so hard to hide, we must pause. Because behind the fame, behind the laughter, behind the sitcom legacy that defined a generation, there lived a man who had always been fighting shadows no audience could ever see. To understand the message Matthew Perry wrote in those final weeks, we have to return to the place where his story truly began. Born in 1969 in Williamstown, Massachusetts, Matthew experienced separation before he even understood the meaning of the word. His mother, a Canadian journalist, and his father, an American actor, split when he was still an infant. What followed was a childhood lived between two worlds, two countries, two parents, two identities, yet belonging fully to neither. He spent his early years in Ottawa, often feeling like a visitor in his own life. He once said he felt alone in a crowded room, even as a child. The constant moving, the shifting routines, and the emotional gap left by his father's absence created a quiet ache that lingered beneath everything he later became. Schoolmates saw him as witty, fast-talking, even charming, traits he would one day turn into comedic gold. But beneath that humor was a boy desperate to be noticed, to be chosen, to be enough. He searched for acceptance in competition, excelling in tennis with a near-obsessive drive, hoping victory might silence the loneliness. It never did. His mother remarried a high-profile political figure, bringing Matthew into a world of diplomats, journalists, and constant busyness. Yet even surrounded by adults and ambition, he felt like an outsider looking in. The emotional turbulence of that environment shaped him in ways he wouldn't understand until much later. Ways that would resurface in addiction, heartbreak, fame, and finally, in the message he wrote just before his death. The seeds of his later struggles were planted early, the longing, the anxiety, the need to fill a void he could never quite name. And those seeds would follow him all the way to Hollywood. Hollywood did not welcome Matthew Perry gently. He had to tear his way into it. In his late teens and early 20s, he hustled through auditions, bit parts, and casting rooms where 1,000 hopefuls waited for their miracle. His charm was unmistakable, but it was his timing, that razor-sharp, lightning-fast, comedic rhythm, that made people turn their heads. Still, even as doors slowly opened, he carried the anxieties and fractures from childhood like invisible luggage. He smiled brightly, but the weight was always there. And then came friends. The role of Chandler Bing wasn't just a part, it fit him like a mirror. His sarcasm, his quick wit, his awkward vulnerability. The world fell in love with it instantly. Overnight, Matthew went from struggling actor to global phenomenon. Crowds cheered, producers praised him. He had the fame he once thought would patch the holes inside him. But fame is a strange, silent thing. It amplifies everything you haven't healed. And for Matthew, it amplified the loneliness he had carried for decades. Behind the scenes, he was battling something far darker than anyone realized. Addiction, self-doubt, and a constant fear of being unworthy. He worked tirelessly, determined to match the expectations placed upon him, terrified of being the one who failed the cast, the show, the audience. His smile on screen was real, but it was also a shield that grew heavier with every season. There were moments of triumph, blockbuster films, award nominations, creative breakthroughs, yet Matthew often felt like he was living two lives. the one the world adored and the one he himself struggled to face. And in the cracks between those two lives, the message he would eventually write began to take shape. As the world laughed with Chandler Bing, Matthew Perry was slowly disappearing behind the curtain of his own pain. Addiction, which had begun as a quiet whisper during his early fame, soon tightened its grip around him with terrifying force. A jet ski accident in 1997 led to a prescription of painkillers that would change the course of his life. What started as relief became dependence, and that dependence quickly spiraled into something darker, something he couldn't control. For years, Matthew lived between two extremes: global adoration and private agony. The effects were devastating. His weight fluctuated dramatically, sometimes so severely that fans wondered if he was even the same person from one season of Friends to the next. There were days he arrived on set exhausted, shaken, or visibly unwell, and yet he performed. He delivered the lines. He made everyone laugh. His talent was undeniable, but behind the laughter, his body and mind were deteriorating. His castmates loved him, worried for him, but Matthew had mastered the art of hiding his suffering. Shame kept him silent. The same shame planted in childhood, now magnified by fame. Rehab visits, hospitalizations, detox cycles, they became recurring chapters of his life. Each time he tried to climb out, something pulled him back down. He later admitted that for entire seasons of Friends, he barely remembered filming. Fans saw the jokes. The world saw the comedic brilliance. But Matthew saw only the void growing inside him, swallowing the man he wished he could be. And yet, amid the darkness, there were glimmers of light. He tried to help others struggling with addiction. He turned his own home into a sober, living space. He spoke publicly, courageously about his failures, but every confession came with a tremor, as if he feared his truth would make people turn away. Eventually, his body slowed. His spirit grew quiet. The fight had taken more from him than most realized, and from that silence, from the exhaustion of decades battling himself, the final weeks of his life began. The last weeks of Matthew Perry's life were strangely quiet, almost unsettlingly so. Friends noticed he had grown more introspective. He moved more slowly, spoke more softly, and spent long stretches of time alone by the water or sitting silently in his home. There was no panic, no visible despair, only a deep, reflective calm that felt like a man finally confronting something he had run from for decades. He tried to stay active, swimming, writing, and keeping some semblance of routine. But there was a heaviness behind his eyes that those close to him couldn't quite name. In those final days, Matthew wrote more than he talked. His journal became the place where he placed everything he couldn't say out loud. And then, just weeks before his death, he wrote a message. Simple, unguarded, and devastating in its honesty. It wasn't meant for a book or an interview. It wasn't a crafted line for a memoir. It was a confession meant only for himself, a truth he had never been brave enough to speak aloud. One afternoon, he stared at a blank page for a long time. Then he finally wrote, "I just wanted to matter, even once, even to someone." Those 10 words carried the entire weight of his life. The broken childhood, the applause that never felt real, the addictions that numbed him, the love he could never quite hold on to. Matthew Perry, the man who made millions feel less alone, had spent a lifetime feeling unseen. The irony was heartbreaking, almost unbearable. He wrote more that week. Notes about gratitude, pain, forgiveness, but that one sentence was the pulse of everything he was trying to say. It was not self-pity, it was longing. A longing for significance that no amount of fame or fortune had ever been able to fill. In the final hours before his passing, he was calm. There was no dramatic moment, no final speech spoken aloud. The last echoes of his truth lived in the ink on that page, the quiet plea of a man who had given so much of himself to the world, and yet believed he had never given enough. When he was found, the world did not just lose a comedian, it lost a soul who had been fighting for meaning until his very last breath. When the news of Matthew Perry's death broke, the world fell into a stunned, aching silence. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe, not just from fans of Friends, but from people who had never met him, yet felt they had known him all their lives. His co-stars spoke of him with a tenderness usually reserved for family. Directors, fellow actors, even quiet crew members remembered the same thing: his gentleness, his generosity, his aching desire to make others smile, even on days when he couldn't smile himself. He didn't leave behind a vast empire or a fortune meant to reshape Hollywood. What he left was far more intimate. He left stories, ones written in books, ones lived on screen, and ones etched into the hearts of those who watched him grow, stumble, fall, and rise again. He left behind the raw honesty of a man who dared to speak publicly about addiction, vulnerability, relapse, and redemption. Many said he saved lives simply by telling the truth about his own, and perhaps he did. His most enduring legacy, though, is quieter. It's the reminder that even the funniest people can be hurting, that even a man adored by millions can feel worthless in the dark, and that the desire to matter, deeply, genuinely, humanly, is something we all carry. So what do we leave behind when the lights finally fade? And whose life will be changed by the words we never had the courage to say out loud? If you believe that Matthew Perry's laughter and his pain still echo across the world, leave a small piece of your heart for him.